Good evening, Kaya and Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Gemma Harrison and I'm an intern at the University of Western Australia's Public Policy Institute. I would firstly like to acknowledge that the university campus we are recording this event on is on traditional land belonging to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, which is also the land of traditional learning. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It is just gone 5:30 p.m. West Australian time, and we'll soon be kicking off the discussion that is looking at ESG investing, specifically diving into best practices, the current framework, and the future of ESG. I'm delighted to welcome you from wherever you may be joining us this evening, whether that be local, interstate, or internationally. So I've been lucky enough to undergo an internship with the Institute this year, and I've had some really amazing opportunities to connect with decision makers, academics, and business leaders, including our distinguished panel tonight, as well as being mentored by the team, Charlotte, Beck, and Chris, to be able to bring tonight's event to you. Before I introduce the panel, if you'll bear with me, I'd like to start with some context. With the world reeling from the effects of COVID-19, climate change, and social inequality, and the risks of a global supply chain crisis, business and companies are feeling the pressure to set new commitments for operating in ways that respect human rights, promote environmental sustainability, and increase social impact. In May 2020, we saw Rio Tinto destroy a 46,000-year-old sacred Aboriginal site of major significance, the Juukan Gorge, for mining purposes. Before the destruction, Rio claimed in their 2019 sustainability report, and I quote, "We are committed to respecting all internationally recognised human rights, including acknowledging and respecting Indigenous peoples' connections to lands and waters. Our teams work in partnership with our communities to understand how our work affects their lives, their culture, and their heritage. We are proud to be the first mining company in Australia to embrace native title to land and to form agreements with traditional owners," end quote. The parliamentary inquiry later found that Rio Tinto had substantial evidence about the importance of the site. Rio were in compliance with all of the relevant laws. However, the destruction was in striking contrast to the ESG ratings that were frequently quoted to investor groups by the company. At the time, CSR Hub gave Rio a 68% rating, compared with more than 20,000 other companies. The Juukan Gorge destruction raises a number of questions that I want to set the scene with tonight, including what is the actual value of ESG measuring, and is it merely a box-ticking exercise? With this in mind, we have a diverse panel with us tonight who will help us to dissect this topic and discuss the future of ESG. First up, we have Tanya Kirkliet. Tanya is a director at KPMG with 13 years of experience providing ESG, sustainability risk, and climate change advisory services to some of Australia's largest companies. Thank you for joining us, Tanya. Second on the panel is Holly Cullen. Holly is an adjunct professor of law at UWA and an international law specialist with an expertise in corporate social responsibility for international business. Thank you so much for joining us, Holly. Thirdly, we have Alex Whitebrook, an ESG communications manager at Minerva Analytics Limited. Alex's role includes devising and implementing integrated communication strategies on ESG and sustainability. Thanks so much for joining us, Alex. Our fourth and final panelist is Melissa Grove, the founding director of Consulting Alchemy. Melissa has more than 18 years of financial and commercial experience across large corporate entities, government, and Big Four firms, and is a non-executive advisory board member at Circular Seed, where she helps businesses on a journey towards circularity with sustainable and smart waste solutions. Thank you for joining us, Melissa. So for tonight, we'll have a moderated discussion for the next 40 minutes or so, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session with the audience. Please feel free to submit all of your questions via the Zoom Q&A function throughout the discussion, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end. So to kick us off, Tanya, I'd like to start with you. Could you quickly just define for the audience in 2 sentences what ESG actually means, and then provide on your thoughts on whether you think the ESG framework effectively captures and measures impacts to the environment or other social impacts. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. 2 sentences. I'm going to struggle with keeping it with that. But maybe if we just define what ESG is to begin with. Yes, it is an acronym that stands for the words environmental, social and governance. And the acronym was devised because it's supposed to cover the 3 pillars of sustainable performance in an organisation. In my view, it's actually just a bit of a buzz term. I do think that it's quite interchangeable with the word sustainability. And it sort of refers to a raft of different concepts and topics that fall into the sustainability space. You know, the concept of sustainable reporting or corporate social responsibility has actually been around for, at least 20 years, if not more. And it's just been slightly rebranded recently as ESG. So I think if you didn't know anything about this topic, told you I couldn't keep it to 2 sentences, but I think the context helps. At the moment, I think if you didn't know anything about this topic, it would be very easy to think that ESG is just an interchangeable term with climate change, given that's the topic that a lot of people are talking about at the moment. But if you think about what falls under the pillars of environment, social and governance, yes, it covers things like climate change, but it also refers to, environmental factors and impacts such as biodiversity, waste, natural resources, water, so under the social umbrella, things like, community investment, community engagement, and those sorts of external community impacts, but internal facing sort of impacts as well on a social level, such as, health and safety of perhaps your internal employees or working conditions of staff or diversity, inclusion, Indigenous employment. And then the governance umbrella sort of covers everything around how an organisation is ethically and appropriately run. So it could cover areas like bribery and corruption, the composition of your board, political lobbying, donations, tax payments, and that kind of thing. So I think when I reflect on that the term ESG itself is probably not a framework. It describes some of the measures that fall into the sustainability space, but I don't think it in itself is a way to capture and measure impacts to the environment or society. But that being said, there are plenty of frameworks that do exist. And actually the challenge that I encounter a lot with my clients and people looking to put their first foray or put first foot into sustainability or ESG reporting is deciding which framework they want to use to measure and report on ESG related data. So there's a lot of different frameworks out there. As KPMG, we do this sustainability reporting survey, and we look at the top 100 companies in the world in each country across 52 countries. So something like 5,200 companies are surveyed and researched. And the most popular framework that we've seen across those companies is far and away the Global Reporting Initiatives, or GRIs. So for the GRI framework under each ESG topic, it sort of provides a framework for you to articulate and report on your different ESG impacts as a company or an organisation. So there are some really good frameworks out there that allow you to capture and measure your impacts as an organisation to the environment and to society. But I think it's the challenge that I'm seeing a lot is getting companies to consistently use those frameworks. Sorry, I hope that answered the question.
Right, no, perfect. Thanks, Tanya. And Melissa, I'd love for you to chime in here and give your perspective on the same thing, whether you think the framework does actually capture or measure the impact of social impacts or environmental.
Thanks very much, Gemma, and great recovery there. Gotta love IT issues, don't you? Tanya, like we said, what a comprehensive explanation. And I really must echo your sentiments there, is that sustainability has been around for such a long time, triple bottom line, corporate social responsibility, and ESG really is the latest buzzword that we have. But do you know the intent and the golden thread that weaves all the way through these is the intent that we should be covering not only quantitative but qualitative data of the way our organizations operate. It's not good enough anymore just to operate within the letter of the law. And perhaps 10 to 15 years ago, when there was no social media, perhaps companies could get away with it. But now with immediate reporting as things occur, if it doesn't feel right, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's okay. So I think this is what's really important, is looking beyond the numbers. And organizations can't operate in silos where they can simply, as long as they meet their own objectives, which may be profit only, they do need to look beyond. They do need to look beyond simply just the numbers at the end of the day, to look at the environmental impacts, the communities that they're operating within, how they're treating their people. Are they diverse? Aren't they? All those questions come up. And the frameworks attempt to capture it. And I think that is something that really resonates, right, Tanya? Like, which framework do you use? And I think that's what we will talk about later on is, how do you find your way through this myriad of different options? Thanks, Gemma.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. I'm now going to jump into some individual kind of questions for the panel. And Holly, I'd love to start with you, kind of looking a bit more broadly and with your expertise. Can or should companies or directors be mandated to consider environmental impacts in their operations, or is there such thing as a corporate duty for corporations to respect human rights and the environment in their day-to-day business?
It depends what you mean by a duty. The law tends to ask directors to act in the best interests of the company as an entity, which usually means the value of the economic value of the company, the profits, and only really at the outer edges, things like not acting corruptly come in. The broader idea of corporate, I mean, in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, they talk about the business duty to respect human rights, and it's always been said that's not a legal duty, it's something else, which we're all still, particularly lawyers who, like, if it's not legal, what is it, are trying to grapple with. But one thing, and I think this is very important also in the context of the Juukan Gorge incident, is the idea of the social license to operate. So, and going, I'm probably the oldest person on this panel, so I go even back further to stakeholder capitalism in the 90s. So we've been trying to find ways of describing this idea that, yes, you may have a legal duty just to maximize the value of your company, but there's something behind that. And even if we can't define that in law, you're going to find that that at a certain stage, as with Juukan Gorge again and some of the directors at Rio Tinto Australia, that there are consequences to that, that there's what, to be very academic about it, might be normative, if not legal. So it has some kind of shaping idea. So I think coming back to, I think there are duties that go beyond the law, but the law corporate law still takes a very narrow view of what the duties of directors are for the most part.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess looking at beyond just the legal duties that you've kind of expressed, what would you say, I guess, is the public expectation of corporate behaviour, either in today's age or just generally?
Well, I think now, and to pick up on an important point that Mel made, with social media, the general public are able to react to issues in the corporate world much more immediately. We have to be, as responsible members of the public, we have to be careful that the information we're acting on is accurate. So we have a responsibility as we participate in those debates, but we can react very quickly to information. And I think I keep coming back to this, but the Juukan Gorge incident does demonstrate that that was a failure of the social license to operate. That was not only the immediately affected people who were the traditional owners felt that their interests were being violated, even if the law was technically being followed, but the broader Western Australian and Australian community felt that their interests had not been respected, and that some kind of unspoken agreement, which we can describe as the social license to operate, had been violated.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Holly. And kind of tying into that, Alex, I'd like to jump to you now. Has ESG become a mere box-ticking exercise or merely like a woke corporatism effort, do you think?
Sure. Thanks, Gemma, and thanks so much for hosting us today. It's a really complicated question to answer, especially in the light of issues like the Juukan Gorge controversy or disaster. I think the idea of painting ESG as woke corporatism is definitely more of a kind of right-wing concept or painting of ESG, because of course that argument paints ESG as something that's putting environmental and social return over financial return, or impact over financial return. And that's simply not what ESG is in practice. ESG, taking things back further, really, if we go really far back, comes from similar kind of ethics-based investing that we've seen since the Quakers. And it's something that wants to include these socially or environmentally responsible concepts into your fiduciary responsibilities, but not put them over the top of everything else. As much as many of us would like that to be the case, that's sadly simply not the way that business is done. So you can see that talking about it as woke corporatism kind of makes it seem like ESG isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, but I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what ESG is. Many companies will always go for short-term financial returns, and we can argue whether or not this central thesis of ESG being about better financial returns in the long run by investing in those social or environmental areas of improving in those areas of your business. We can argue whether that thesis is true or untrue, but at the end of the day, companies that leave themselves open to social or environmental risks, leaving themselves open to risk of stranded assets, and being an early mover on ESG is extremely important. So I wouldn't really call it woke corporatism per se, but when we come around to the tick boxing, I think that really draws out the question: is ESG good enough? Because ESG, like Tanya said, it's not exactly a framework. I would say it's a framework of thinking about a company's impact on these areas, society, environment, and the internal areas like governance of the company. But it's not really, it's very two-dimensional in many ways. And in reality, it's what we're talking about, or the heart of what the market is trying to get to, I think, and the light at the end of the tunnel is sustainability. Stewardship codes around the world and different initiatives like the EU's new disclosure rules, financial disclosures, what's it called? Sustainable Disclosures Initiative, whatever it is, SFDR. I wish I could remember things in terms other than their acronyms, but unfortunately that's the world we live in. SFDR and other things like this is showing that this kind of tick boxing and two-dimensional approach to ESG and just putting information out there that's not regulated in any way is becoming unacceptable. And we've seen that in what you read out at the very beginning of this webinar with Rio Tinto's really terrifying statement to paint that as a picture right before for their investors, right before the Juukan Gorge disaster. So I think what we're seeing is a good shift towards stricter regulation of ESG related disclosures, and that's going to really help strengthen ESG investing and make it less of a box ticking exercise for companies, because they're finally, they will be regulated. And we've seen the reactions already, or like the result already, with things like the Australian Securities and Investment Commission fining, I forget which energy company it was now, Tullow Energy Company, for greenwashing in their annual report. So we're actually seeing that kind of turnaround. Anyway, I go on, but it's a very nuanced question, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Alex. And I guess we've seen a really recent kind of trend and move towards ESG. do you feel that the invest in ESG trend is likely to continue growing steadily for years to come, or do you think it will kind of remain stagnant?
Sure. Well, I'll try and reel myself in for this one because I feel like I went off on a bit of a tangent in response to your previous question. But ESG, everyone's already said it. It's not something that's just come out of nowhere. It's been around for a long time, over 200 years, I would argue, and it's grown stronger and developed to be more comprehensive in many ways. This kind of way of thinking about investing. And expanding things beyond fiduciary duty in terms of financial return. But there's going to be a lot of hiccups. I think stricter regulation and standardization could save ESG from itself. ESG is something that a lot of people increasingly don't like. There's definitely a growing, as we've seen in the US in particular, a growing counter movement to ESG from a right-wing perspective, but also from a more left-wing perspective and environmentalist perspective. There are a lot of ESGs making a lot of enemies, and rightly so. Again, when we look at that kind of central example of today's chat, the Juukan Gorge disaster. So I think it will stick around, but it's going to really rely on continuing this current trend of stricter regulation and standardization of ESG reporting by companies.
Amazing. Thank you, Alex. Tanya, I'd like to jump to you now and kind of looking a little bit more at the technicality side. What impact do you think that shareholders have? And is current ESG investing bringing value to what investors and shareholders actually want to see?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've got specific views on this. You know, I've been in this space for a really long time now, like 13 years. You know, I've started part-time at KPMG in this space when there wasn't a justification for a full-time person, and then 7 or 8 years full-time, which I feel like is ancient in ESG land. And you know, back then when there was minimal investment in ESG and no one was really interested in this topic, you know, to now, it's been really interesting to see that change and what's been driving that. You know, people do ask all the time, you know, why has ESG become more popular? And there are many reasons. You know, part of it is, I think, you know, genuinely altruistic. I think, you know, the world is, you know, we talked about social media just earlier, and, you know, the increase in the use of social media has highlighted these topics to a more global audience. So, you know, I think there are altruistic reasons, like the world is becoming more environmentally and socially conscious. But unfortunately, in this world, more than anything, money talks. And as soon as there was a commercial imperative to invest in greener funds, and that those funds demonstrated more resiliency than other stocks in the market, or when funds like BlackRock started investing into greener assets, I feel that is when we saw the dial really shift on this conversation and ESG became more mainstream. So, you know, one of the examples I have actually was really interesting when COVID happened. You know, the rest of the market sort of was crashing. But if you looked at ESG investments over that time period, they either did less worse than the rest of the market, or while the rest of the market was making a loss, what we saw in the US was that ETFs there that were linked to ESG were actually making a really good profit. So I do think that investment and funding considerations really have gone hand in hand with the increased focus on ESG. That being said, while some of the motivation, I think, might be money driven to do better in this space, I do genuinely believe that it is driving some good, genuine change within some companies. You know, many clients I speak to in organisations are, you know, I don't think most people are not inherently bad. I think that, you know, this space is drawing hardworking, altruistic people who are really now using or trying to use the funds and money and attention on this topic to drive real change and conversations in their organisations. You know, I'm seeing some really ambitious net zero targets. Whilst they might not be publicly disclosed internally, they're really working hard to try to, you know, focus on decarbonisation efforts and to drive real change in organisations. I'm not saying all companies are like that, but some of the companies that I'm working with are. And we're also seeing some really amazing social investment projects. So, you know, I know that the conversation around mining and in the media, that there's a really negative focus, and, you know, you bring up Rio Tinto example. But the money that I've seen mining bring into certain communities, for example, has really transformed some of those communities. And I think what better example than the prosperity that our state has seen? We have really been, sorry, the lights go off at 6 o'clock here. It's very energy efficient. What better example than the prosperity that our state has seen? We've really benefited from some of the change that mining has brought in. So I think that even those companies that are just driven by, you know, getting a better rating from an ESG rating agency, they're still, you know, driving meaningful change in those organisations, even if it's just a response to having to be seen to be more, you know, environmentally or socially conscious. They are then, it's almost like the chicken and the egg. What comes first, the commercial imperative to be more environmentally and socially conscious, or actually becoming environmentally and socially conscious? Well, I'm actually seeing in practice that both are happening. So, yeah, I think that slowly but surely, the ESG investing is bringing about what investors and shareholders want to see, even if it is in a backwards way and sometimes even a little bit unintentional by some organisations.
Okay, thanks, Tanya. And I guess what we saw, you know, the shareholders' response to the Juukan Gorge destruction, and Alex, I wouldn't mind if you could chime in here if you had any views. We saw that the shareholders' response was to push out the executives and directors who were involved or responsible for the destruction. I guess, what are your thoughts on what impact shareholders can have?
Shareholders have a huge impact. You know, it's not really it's kind of a flipped perspective to think that shareholders are the little guy in this situation. In fact, they are the owners of these public companies, and if what they're calling for is stricter management of ESG considerations, then companies need to respond, or they face, you know, huge risk financially. So I think shareholders absolutely are the bottom line of the ESG movement, and you've seen a lot more shareholder activism, increasingly so in recent years. You have things like the Say on Climate movement that's really grown up the ranks, and this is, I think, what we're seeing is a step change in the way ESG is interpreted. For example, to kind of back up the strength that shareholders have, you have things like the PRI putting out the Active Ownership 2.0 report that they published recently, and that's talking about shareholders being much more active owners, engaging companies and using their right as shareholders to really drive change outside of annual general meetings and outside of just voting on their shares on issues like climate change reports. So what we're seeing is, with many thanks to ESG, I guess, like Tanya mentioned, it's kind of moving the needle a little bit. We're seeing a much stronger push for active ownership by shareholders and using their privilege to really engage companies like Rio Tinto and tell them how they need to do their jobs. So that's quite useful, I think. Yeah, and hopefully the shareholder activism doesn't run out of steam around these areas.
Great, thanks, Alex. Back to you, Tanya. Do you think that ESG is something of value to companies of only specific industries?
I think the answer to this question is whether you think that ESG is an important topic generally, because I think fundamentally we're asking, or is ESG important? Is it of value to all companies, or is it just of value to particular industries? And my personal view is it is important and highly relevant to all industries and all companies. But I guess that's my own personal values, that I think that this is a really important topic. But I also think that we can't just be focusing on specific industries. You know, that there is at the moment, for example, in WA, you know, 80% of our state sort of, you know, businesses are related in some way to mining. But, you know, it can't just be that the focus is on mining. It takes all of us as a collective to make a change. That being said, I do think that the ESG focus in funding and in reporting has a lot of value in higher risk industries like mining, for example. And actually, you know, I guess in my view, what we're seeing is that we've seen higher transparency, all levels of disclosure and action, where we're seeing drives of change more in those higher industries because of the focus on ESG and social license to operate. So I think that, in short, ESG, I think, is value to all companies, but certainly a framework for measurement and reporting of impacts on ESG or the impacts of that companies are having on ESG is probably higher for those sort of higher exposed industries where they might have more impact or higher risk related to ESG matters.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Melissa, we'll jump to you now. My first question for you is, what do you think are the main challenges for small to medium-sized companies to understand how ESG is relevant, and how can they introduce sustainable practices into their business?
Thanks, Gemma. If I could just add something just to the shareholder question. I got a bit excited. I had my hand up and I was like, oh, is this participative anyway? Just very interesting seeing how the landscape has changed as well. So on a lot of investor calls nowadays, you have fund managers of big pension and superannuation funds like we have in Australia, asking questions on behalf of these shareholders. So anticipating. So for example, even with the big pension funds, knowing that they have, you know, thousands of mum and dad investors suddenly questioning, you know, on quarterly investor calls, raising questions around ESG, which just shows how much pressure they're receiving internally as well. So that groundswell, you know, Alex, we're talking about how does this continue through? You'll see, you know, like people want to know, will I have water for my children when we grow up? You know, what's going to happen to my grandkids? So you don't only have these active shareholders who might be picketing on the streets, but also, you know, normal mum and dads, grandpas, pops, mums and pops, you know, anyone actually putting pressure on their superannuation funds to be like, no, guys, the time of, you know, oil and gas resources investing is over. What are we going to do from the green side? So a lot of pressure from that side as well. So I thought that was relevant to share. But to my friends, my small and medium corporations, you know, I think, Tanya, was it you that says money talks, and I think something else walks, right? But at the moment, our big corporates, you know, they're able to pay for the best advice to have, you know, like a massive team to be able to work out what does ESG mean, and, you know, how is it going to work in the organizations. But the biggest challenges that we face in the small to medium arena, and dare I say even big, you know, like companies that have big revenue streams, but what do you do? What information? There's such influx, like Tanya was saying, so many different frameworks that we have. What do you do? And, you know, Alex, you talked about the lack of regulation, but I think this is the most important thing, and something that I'm very passionate about helping the broader business community as well, is like, what is right for us? Do you know, the access to the information? And I think the most important thing you can do as a small to medium organization is actually to ask the questions and keep asking until you get the answer that makes sense to you. Do you know, do not be shy to be like, that doesn't make sense for me. Do you know, question your accountants, your auditors, do you know, like anyone who will listen. And do you know, Tanya and I were actually, Tanya presented a different panel that I attended in the audience. And I remember her saying there's just access to so much information out there. If you look, you will find. And I think that is really important to remember, that you don't have to do everything. Do you know, like to introduce sustainable practices, you don't have to do everything. You need to start and look at what is the core purpose of your organization and what impacts do you have from, you know, like going back to this ESG term, but from a financial sustainability, from an environmental sustainability, from a social sustainability perspective, and start from your internal organizational strategy and then work out what is appropriate and applicable. So again, like moving away from this box sticking, you know, we're not implementing processes because it's required by a framework. We're implementing processes because it's a part of what you do. It's a part of what your organization is set up for. So introducing sustainable practices, you know, as Gemma was, your initial question was asking, Gemma, it's really like go back to your core organizational strategy. So ESG should be weaved into the fabric of what your organization does. So when you're having your business planning and your strategy day, whether it's once, twice, 50 times a year, whenever your organization does it, weave ESG into the fabric of what your organization does.
Amazing. Thank you, Melissa. When it comes to ESG, what would you say are some of the common risks that companies should avoid, and how can they avoid them?
A couple spring to mind straight away. And I think the immediate reaction is always to do everything. Oh, let's do it all. let's report it all, and you hire a consultant, they come in and they give you this massive framework. I'm sure, like some framework, we don't know what it's based on, we don't know how it's relevant, and then it just continues. That becomes a box ticking exercise. So I think really going back to the beginning, understanding, your organizational perspective, educating yourself, and actually questioning, who do you have to be able to guide you through this? I think that's really important. You don't have to do it all. And I think a key concept that is really critical across all the different frameworks we come about, and I know, Tanya, I hope you'd laugh because, the different definitions of materiality. So it's a very, there's a lot of conversation happening around what materiality means, but essentially it's, what's a needle mover for your business? That is what you should be reporting on. What's going to move the bar for your organization? And I think, Alex, you talked about, the financial reporting standards coming out. So the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, gotta love an acronym, coming out under the International Financial Reporting Standards Board. So a lot of organizations will be compelled to report, but this should, like making yourself familiar with what needs to be reported is important, and really pushing back. If like it doesn't make sense, keep asking. And then the second one is really greenwashing. And Alex, I think that's what you brought up, is really, organizations are being held to account. And, I'm an auditor from a long time ago, and you're never an ex-auditor, that's what I always say. But, if it's not documented, it's not done. So be careful with what you, what you say you are doing. Make sure it can be reported. Make sure that you have data to support it, that you have a basis. Be careful about putting anything out there, any conjecture that could be misconstrued in lots of different ways. And in the media, you don't have to look far to see organizations that have been taken through the ringer for misrepresenting, maybe omitting, perhaps saying things. So that is really important, is understand you want to demonstrate and show your organizations in the best possible light. However, do take it with a grain of salt. Thanks, Gemma.
Thank you, Melissa. I was now hoping we could kind of go through each of you, and Holly, I might start with you. If you could all kind of answer somewhat in 30 seconds or less what you think the future of ESG is, and how also can companies prioritize this in their practice. Holly, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Well, I think the future is that there's going to be more external activism on this subject. 20, 30 years ago, the companies that were exposed were the ones who were consumer facing, who produced consumer products, and people cared whether their running shoes were made by child labor. Now, and it's become now, the risk also is for companies public companies with lots of investors. So there are lots of campaigns for superannuation schemes to divest from fossil fuels and push their funds further down the line of ESG. So I think there's going to be more organized activism. I think Mel explained it very well in terms of, lots of investors care about these things more than they used to. And I think what companies have to do is accept that new reality, that even if there isn't much of a change in the regulatory environment, although I think there is a much broader interest in the investor community, small and large, right up to Mike Cannon-Brookes, changing the board at AGL. I'm surprised no one's mentioned that yet. I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thanks, Holly. Alex, did you have anything to add to that? What the future of ESG you think it is?
It's tricky to answer, but if, to answer in my own biased way, I guess there's no other way, I would hope for greater standardization of ESG disclosures by companies. And hopefully, I think we're starting to see it, the kind of pivot away from ESG specifically. I know we're in the middle of, the ESG boom right now, but I think we'll see a pivot away from that towards just talking about sustainability more generally, not just. I think ESG, Tanya kicked us off really well, talking about how it's quite a limited term, really, and what I think it's trying to get at is sustainability. And what I'd really like to see is the convergence of the way we talk about ESG with a framework for talking about impacts like the SDGs and the specific targets set by the SDGs. If we could see a movement in that direction, I think it's one of the options, and I think it's probably one of the best options. So hopefully we'll see that.
Great, thanks, Alex. Tanya, did you have anything to add?
I feel like I'm just repeating what others are saying already around this topic, because I do think that we've sort of reached critical mass on this topic, and it's really hard to go back from where we have come to as a society, where there is just so much focus and momentum behind focusing on ESG impacts and the drivers of minimizing the impacts on our environment and society, but also reporting on those. So I think a lot of people ask me if if I think that the popularity of ESG as a topic is just a flash in the pan, or if we can expect it to continue. And I think, don't get me wrong, particularly in WA, if there were things like geopolitical tensions or factors that resulted in things like the iron ore price dropping, or if there was a downturn in the mining boom, there might be austere times where we curtail the money that some of these companies are spending on some of their environmental and social initiatives. But despite this, I don't think the narrative around ESG and particularly decarbonisation, I think at the moment in particular, will slow down. I've heard it described as a race to net zero, and I think people at the very least see that there is good business sense in achieving a decarbonised economy. And I also think that there is going to be regulation introduced by things like the ISSB standards and other sort of regulation that will make this area mandatory. I mean, we're seeing this in other jurisdictions already, where, for example, in the UK and New Zealand, reporting on the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, is now mandatory. So there isn't coming back from that. It is becoming business as usual. And I think to achieve this well, the companies that I see doing this best and responding to these risks best are those that embed ESG as part of their normal sort of business as usual strategy, so that it is discussed as part of their day-to-day operations, not just some far off, low risk sort of issue that there's not a lot of focus on. They're actually embedding this into their overall business strategies as part of their core strategies, so that it's not just ESG, but it's another business risk like commodity risk or foreign currency exchange risk that the organisation manages as part of its day-to-day risk framework. So I think that is how companies should think of this in future. It is a business risk, and they need to respond to it as such. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Melissa, did you have any final thoughts on this one?
Oh, lucky last. I can say I echo the sentiments of everyone on the panel. That really, like Tanya was saying, and Alex and Holly as well, really looking forward to sustainability being a part of business as usual. So like Tanya was saying, like making sure that this is just like everything else you talk about at an organizational level, ensuring it's just another, it's not anything special that's discussed. It's simply the way that we do business. So really looking forward to that. And if I could end on a bit of a thought bubble, is really, it's continuous learning and growth, like nothing to steal one of Deloitte's old values, but really, that there's not a bus stop that you get to and that's your end destination. Things are changing constantly. there's continuous exposure drafts and another exposure draft and another round table. So really, from a reporting and regulatory perspective, we're really finding our way as a community of practice almost to figure out what is sufficient and appropriate, and like what is the appropriate level of disclosure. So yes, that's it from me, Gemma. Keep learning.
Thanks, Mel. That brings us to the end of the panel discussion. We will jump to the Q&A now. Thank you to everyone who has sent in your questions. We've got quite a few here, so I'll try and direct them, but otherwise I'll open them up to the panel. Starting with the first one that's come through, someone who's become interested in plastic credits. What are your thoughts on companies purchasing credits that fund projects to remove plastic waste from the environment with the hope of having this recognised in their ESG scores or other sustainability measures? How could this inclusion be increased if you believe it is a valuable corporate action? I'll open that up to the panel.
I can kick this off, I think. It's really interesting to see that question, because and actually the question around biodiversity impacts generally, and the question around plastic pollution getting more I suppose attention and focus. We saw this pathway taken with carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's really the flavour at the moment, and the focus of a lot of companies is to reduce their emissions. And we saw this pathway taken where it was first the companies were expected to report on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then they were expected to introduce carbon offsets, and then it was meaningful emissions reductions, and then there was a framework released in the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures that really then drove the reporting and measurement of this in this space. And I think that what we're expecting to see, I think, is a similar pathway that will be taken on with biodiversity-related impacts. There's just been recently released the BETA sort of framework for the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, which is very similar to the TCFD in the way it's set up, but it's the focus, rather than being on emissions, will be on biodiversity sort of related impacts. And I think that it's hard to predict what the future holds, but if it follows a similar trajectory to the TCFD, which is, like I mentioned earlier, now legislated in certain countries and is a precursor to the ISSB standards, which may well be made mandatory to report on in different jurisdictions globally when they're released in final. I think that it's something that we could see happen with things like biodiversity-related impacts and stuff like, how does plastic pollution impact the environment, and then reporting on that, and then potentially, like the person has asked, having plastic credits to then, use that as a way to offset sort of the impact of that plastic pollution. I mean, this is all predicated on, the TNFD maybe following the same pathway as the TCFD, but I'm certainly seeing that the conversations around board tables are increasing on this topic, and they are asking, well, what do we do now that the BETA framework of the TNFD has been released? Do we need to respond? What do we need to do? So that there's increased interest and focus. I think it'll just be slow, like the TCFD. I mean, that being said, the TCFD was released in 2017, and since that time, it's just 60% or more of companies now report on the TCFD or use it as one of the frameworks for reporting. So perhaps we'll see, sort of rapid take up with the TNFD as well. I'll stop there.
I think, Mel, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, just to add something to your, Tanya, beautiful explanation, but also to remember that from a shareholder and investor perspective and owner perspective, they also want to see meaningful change. So, seeing organizations have plastic credits, carbon credits, bin credits, whatever credits you like. If you're not making meaningful change in your organization, you're simply just getting credits to offset, any naughtiness you're doing out there that, should be done. That will be judged quite harshly as well. So I think it makes sense to be part of an overall, going back to, again, a meaningful strategy for the organization is very important. And all these different credits and bits and pieces are part of that meaningful strategy, but I think it's not, in isolation.
Great, thank you. I'll jump to the next question. It doesn't look like it's been directed at anyone, so I'll put it to the panel again. The person has asked, I was wondering whether any of the speakers have seen ESG being applied to for-purpose organisations such as charities. I'm interested to hear in views on whether ESG might distract for-purpose organisations from their primary purpose, such as social welfare or education, or whether you think ESG might help in the same way as for-profit companies.
I'd love.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, you go now. You go. I love that you're jumping in together. You go ahead.
We're the chatterboxes on the panel. Sorry, Alex or Holly can like elbow out the way. Just from that, I've been quite involved with social enterprise, and I think what ESG has done is given really good brackets for strategy development. So this, instead of being a separate bespoke exercise, it's really about, how do you set the guiding path for this organization? So coming back to what is the intention? What is the intent of these organizations to exist? And ESG and sustainability is really at the heart of it. But Alex, I'll kick it over to you.
No worries. Yeah, I'm pretty much just going to reiterate what you said. I think that ESG is something that's at the heart of for-purpose organizations in many ways. So I think the thing that benefits them most is the G on that to create frameworks and standards to make sure that there's plenty of publicly available information for what good governance looks like, which is very important. It's an issue that for-purpose organizations, I'm sure from your own work, constantly struggling with, or any organization for that matter. But this is something that within ESG, I think particularly applies to for-purpose organizations.
Great, thanks, Alex. We'll jump to the next one, actually, Alex, while I've got you. This one's directed at you. Alex, you mentioned the first mover advantages of embracing ESG reporting. Are there any disadvantages of being the first mover?
I would love to say no, but obviously the ESG space is a little all over the place, and Mel really touched on the costs that companies can incur by trying to be first movers and trying to figure out what good ESG disclosure looks for them. Looks like for them, and likewise on the investor side, if you're trying to or something along those lines, there are big concerns that what the companies in that index are actually doing is just box ticking, and not in fact actual sustainable changes to the company. That it is greenwashing. So the biggest, from back to the company perspective, the biggest first mover risk would definitely be you are your own worst enemy. What you need to do is look at what is material to you and make sure you're not greenwashing. That would be the biggest risk as being a first mover, especially with the inevitable increase in regulation that we'll see.
Interesting. Thanks, Alex. Another question that's come through looks like it's for Holly. You mentioned the duty of a company to act in the best interests of the company, and that this is interpreted as financial. But if you look at why companies were established in the early 1900s, it was to ensure that these entities behaved appropriately within society. Therefore, has the duties of directors been perverted over the years, and in particular by Milton Friedman? And therefore, we should go back to why corporations were established, and that was to control individual self-interested behaviours, and as such, they inherently have a social function.
Milton Friedman obviously has a lot to answer for. He said that the only corporate social responsibility was to make a profit, and that for years I saw that quote in every article I read about CSR and business and human rights. I think we've moved on from that, but I think that we are dealing with the corporate law world which is based on trust law and is now heavily regulated by statute. Oh, what was somebody saying, that Commonwealth corporate law is something like 600 pages. It's a massive, massive area of regulation, and duties of directors have tended to be very, certainly in the modern era, much more inward facing, and duties to investors, which is why I was saying that I thought that investor activism was actually one of the things that was going to contribute to changing culture as much as external regulation. And, you know, going back to the 19th century, although, yes, corporations were seen as having a social purpose, they were also there to create the corporate veil. So basically to protect the individual or individuals who founded the company and separate their individual property from that of the corporation. So to some extent, the corporation as a legal instrument has always been about the economic and property position of the company itself. But I think that there can be, certainly, you know, what is in a statute can be taken out of a statute and replaced with something else. We can redefine the duties of directors. The difficulty is we have a very clear idea of what duties, the director's duties from an economic perspective mean, and the duties to shareholders. But it will actually be from a regulatory point of view, I think, quite challenging to draft duties in relation to social purpose and ESG ideas generally, because these are, I don't think they're vague, it's more that they're just very wide-ranging. And I think it's going to be really difficult from, you know, I wouldn't want to be the legislative drafting team trying to make this a workable statute. So I think it's going to happen. So I think that it's going to happen through indirect regulation, like through ASIC saying you can't do things that are greenwashing and things like that, rather than through duties of directors. That's just fearless prediction.
Great, thanks, Holly. Another question, I'll put it to the panel. Maybe Tanya, you could kick us off with this one. Do ESG strategies and reporting look and work differently for public organisations such as utilities industries?
I had to, my computer restarted and started doing updates, so I had to log in on my phone. So I apologize, I had to find the mute button on my phone. Absolutely, and it goes to, I think a couple of people made the point earlier around, you know, when you're reporting on ESG topics, you know, it's really important to define what's material to you as an organisation. Like if I think about the contrast between a bank, for example, versus a mining company, I mean, the number one material topic I've seen for most mining companies at the moment is climate change, whereas maybe that's less of a consideration for banks, unless they're, you know, they're investing into certain funds that might drive climate change. But, you know, it might be you know, technology risk, for example, which is considered maybe an ESG risk for some of these banks. So I certainly think that there will be a difference between what is reported between different companies and also the strategy that they put in place around how they manage their ESG impacts and their impacts on the world. So certainly I do think that there will be a difference. But that being said, you know, there should be a consideration that this population of material topics in the ESG space, there is often a risk. You don't want to be doing everything at once, but often a lot of organisations have impacts across many different sort of ESG impacts, and there'll be areas where, you know, you can focus your impacts, but you often find that a lot of companies, particularly the larger ones in the ASX 100, will have to focus on, you know, quite a few, and actually responding to how they will assess and manage and measure impact across many sort of different topics in the ESG space, maybe up to 20 sort of material areas. So I think in short, yes, there will be a difference in how you manage and report on those, depending on your industry, depending on a lot of different factors, and how you define materiality. We probably don't have time to get into that today, but to Mel's point earlier, that is up for debate at the moment. But yes, there is a difference, I think. So I'll pause there.
Mel, did you want to jump in?
Lots to say, Tanya. Obviously, we can talk all night long. But really, like with government, I think there's another question there that talks about, the role of government in the current ESG movement. Sorry to jump ahead, Gemma, but I think it's very relevant, the role of government. We also have citizens. Do you know, like you've got a very wide public sector that the government is accountable to. So their reporting is different because I think their shareholders are each and every one of us, right? It's public funding that's being used, and to ensure that it's actually being done in an ethically and sustainable manner is very important. I mean, we'd all like to make sure our dollars being used in the most effective and efficient manner, right? So that's what I just wanted to add in on that.
And with that role of government, did anyone else want to jump onto this one? What does the panel believe is the role of government in this current ESG movement?
Well, I'll start. Obviously, government is where regulation comes from for the most part. There is always some self-regulation of professions, including the financial services professions. But the government can create, basically what regulation does is create incentives and disincentives, much more so than actually banning things. So again, using the greenwashing example, if you report in a way that you cannot back up, the regulatory bodies will penalize you. And that not only, the penalty itself may not be particularly concerning to a big organization, but the fact of having been publicly penalized will. And that, because one thing I don't think we said is, once you talk about the relationship between a company and its investors, that is to some extent a relationship of trust. And that means that if investors feel that they can't trust that the reports a company is issuing are accurate and reflect a genuine change to the way they're working, then that will, that will have an impact. And I mean, you see that when sometimes companies that have had a bit of a bad time rebrand themselves, rename themselves, as if people will forget what happened, will forget if they don't hear the same name attached to it. So I think a lot of smart regulation is about creating incentives to do the right thing and disincentives to do the wrong thing, because we also have to think about the cost of regulation, not only to the bodies that are being regulated, but to the government. And, which is why there are some things where we put a law on the books, but it doesn't really affect much change because the cost of enforcing it, of having inspections or audits or whatever to make sure people are conforming with it, is too high. So you have to think about where is the best way. I think the ACCC is also a good way, because I think that, relating to what I was saying before, sometimes consumers and investors have similar interests in terms of corporate behavior. So I think that government can do a lot in the regulatory space to create incentives to be honest and accurate, and to make sure your reporting is reflecting the real world. Because what I see in terms of corporate accountability activists is a lot of cynicism about reporting. You see it in the modern slavery space, which the Institute covered last couple of weeks ago, and in ESG. you know, that there's a sense of, does the reporting actually reflect a reality of conforming with these values? And I've spoken too long, but I'll stop now.
No, that's great. Thanks, Holly. Mel, did you want to jump in? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I was like, why is my hand up all the
Oh.
time? But I also thinking about like what's the sexy side of government as well. Do you know, listening to all the lobbyists, like they're, you know, like implementing and impacting, like you were saying, Holly, like policy change. Like there's a very, very impactful way that the government can play a role here to be able to put together, do you know, the voices of those who perhaps individually would not be able to move. They might not be shareholders, do you know? They're trying to make a difference in the world. So, do you know, like the government is a very powerful pathway for, do you know, common interest groups to be able to drive change.
Great, thanks, Mel. I've got a couple more questions left. This one just looks like to the panel as well. Could you please share your insights on which frameworks are used most frequently? I know we touched on this a little bit, but if anyone had anything to add.
I saw this one come up and I'm like, yep, that one's in my wheelhouse. Things that I can
You
talk
go for it,
about.
Tanya.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do this. I mentioned this reporting survey, and it's really interesting because it is the number one question that I get asked by clients is which framework do I use? There are so many, I don't know where to start. And the number one framework that is currently being used globally at the moment is still the Global Reporting Initiatives. It is so embedded within you know, just sort of normative practice in different jurisdictions on how sustainability reporting should be, you know, so how sustainability, I should say, should be reported on. We also see that there are certain industry associations, for example, the International Council of Mining and Metals actually calls out that, you know, if you are a member of the ICMM, that you should report on sustainability. You should use the GRI to report on it, and then you should also get assurance against that framework and your sustainability reporting externally. But there are so many other frameworks, and it really depends on what your purpose is for reporting. For example, there is the SASB framework, and a lot of companies that have a US investor base or exposure to US capital are using SASB because it is commonly used, but, you know, it's been very promulgated by BlackRock Fund, for example. So they were a really big proponent of creating and establishing and then promoting the use of the SASB as a framework. There's also the TCFD framework. So I was mentioning earlier that has increased, you know, the use of that by companies to report on climate risk in particular has increased exponentially, and it is being firstly legislated and mandated in certain jurisdictions for use, but it is the precursor to the climate standard under the ISSBs or International Sustainability Standards. And it would be remiss of me not to talk about the ISSBs. So that has been seen, you know, there's been a lot of talk about convergence of different frameworks. And, you know, I think a lot of people, you know, at COP last year thought that the Holy Grail had come in the form of the International Sustainability Standards and the two standards that have been released by the ISSB. There's, you know, maybe it hasn't quite achieved convergence. There's a lot of different sort of feedback that's been received by the ISSB on those two standards. But certainly what I'm seeing in practice is that a lot of companies, whether or not, you know, the AASB adopts the ISSBs in their current form, you know, the companies are expecting that there will be a stakeholder expectation that they report on the two ISSB standards. So a lot of companies are jumping to doing gap analyses, to seeing, you know, where they need to report against in alignment with that framework. So I think that long story and long answer and long-winded way to say that I think it depends on your purpose. I think the GRI is a really good start and is most commonly used as a language or a framework for reporting on sustainability, but that there are other frameworks, just being conscious that there are other frameworks that are out there depending on how you want to report on this or the reason why you want to report. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Tanya. Alex, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I think there's also this discussion about different frameworks, because we also need to mention the CDP. Gets into one of the other issues with the ESG kind of space in general, which is this undefined word salad that it can feel like sometimes. I think that what investors are like really looking for is to have one standard kind of disclosure, but I don't know if that's ever actually going to happen. We talked a lot today about standardizing disclosures from companies and the increasing convergence. I think that is a good thing. I don't know if it'll ever actually happen, but what does need to happen is that there needs to be standards for what kinds of metrics companies are actually reporting on. When it comes to the frameworks and things like ESG ratings, which cop a lot of flack in the ESG space for being undefined and not at all regulated, I would say the fundamental issue is going to be making sure that the actual the metrics that these different frameworks and different disclosure standards use are aligned. They can be different. They can cover different things. GRI doesn't cover forestry, but CDP does. So that's going to be more useful, at least in the short term, for companies that want to report on their biodiversity impacts. There's always going to be these differences. It's part of having a market, but yeah, it's just kind of getting up on my soapbox there. I think that it's gonna, yeah, all the different frameworks, I don't think we'll see that change despite some standardization. They all hold an important place, like Tanya said.
Great, thanks, Alex. One last question we've got in here. I wonder if anyone is able to answer this one. Are you aware of any ESG data provider that uses space technologies to derive objective measurements? I'll put that to the panel.
Space is in spatial or space is in space agency? Because I have seen
it must be spatial, right?
I think so, and it's a really good point actually, because I thought for a minute, like, oh, we're getting into, you know, intergalactic sort of considerations here. I have seen that, and it has been used in particular for rehabilitation or for biodiversity sort of related reporting. You know, drone usage actually has really increased over the last sort of 3 to 4 years around, you know, being able to measure spatially, you know, areas of disturbance and then areas of rehabilitation, and being able to accurately measure that. I think with everything, it's cost versus value output for a lot of companies. So I've seen this really actually quite well embedded in companies that are quite large and have the money and resources to be able to do this, because it's actually, you know, it's actually more efficient to report on it that way than trying to do estimates. Whether that should be mandated, I guess again it comes down to, yeah, I think, you know, considering the cost of that technology and the company's footprint, I think you know, there should ideally, you know, in an ideal world, everyone would be able to use that sort of objective measurement to report on these topics. But unfortunately, not everyone has the resources, and I think it's about being pragmatic as well as to what the value of that outcome is. Often the difference between, you know, a drone measurement and an estimate based on, or you know, a more manual kind of measurement is actually quite small, because, you know, the manual sort of measurement is actually pretty close to what the like a, you know, a more spatial type measurement is. Sorry, yeah, I'll stop there.
Mel, did you want to jump in?
Sorry, Matthias, I see you put a little clarification there, but I think relevant nonetheless is using tech and being able to substantiate. And so it's coming back to like a bit of a topic that's very close to my heart there. You know, if it's not documented, it's not done. And also if you don't have the data to support it. So regardless of the technology that's being used, it's going back to the purpose and strategy of the organization. What are you doing and what do you have to actually demonstrate? So if you have to demonstrate remediation of land, what do you have to do? Like, what technologies are available to facilitate that? Do you know if you need to, you know, regeneration? There's lots of things that need to be demonstrated, and they're very data based. And the challenge, going back to my friends in the small and medium organizations, is how do you demonstrate end-to-end supply chain? You know, like if you don't have technology to make it more cost effective. So I do think that's an important consideration. And going forward, I anticipate that you'd see it more in order to make it affordable for organizations on the other you know, end of the cost spectrum to be able to afford you know, demonstrating their impact.
Great, thanks, Mel. Well, if no one else has anything to add, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion this evening. I personally would like to thank our amazing panel for your contributions tonight. You've all brought such a unique perspective and background, and we're so grateful to learn from your expertise. I'd also like to thank the UWA PPI team, Bet, Chris and Charlotte, for allowing me the opportunity to run my own event and giving me guidance throughout the process. While I've got you here as well, I would just like to mention our 2 final events of the year. I think Beck has put them in the chat. They're all on our website as well, but we've got one next Wednesday, the 30th of November, a breakfast by the Bay, Australia's prospects in the global economy for 2023. And then later on the 14th of December, we've got a hybrid event on lobbying regulation in Australia. So once again, thank you to all of our panel. It's been so great tonight. I've enjoyed the discussion so much. So thank you so much for all of your time and have a great night, everyone.